All right. Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to Free History. I'm your host, Will Hickox of the Watkins Museum of History. Free History is a series of interviews with historians and other scholars touching on connections between historical events and the issues of today. This series is a partnership between the Hall Center for the Humanities, Humanities Kansas, Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, the Watkins Museum of History, and the University of Kansas Department of African and African American Studies. Today's event is also part of Cold War in the Heartland, a series of programs marking the launch of a new website. The Cold War in the Heartland is a new and free resource for students, teachers, and members of the public, created by several departments at KU. I'd also like to thank Sunflower Publishing and Lawrence Magazine for helping to promote this event. So today, I'm honored to speak with Daniel A. Scherson, whom I've known actually for several years now. Danny has led an amazingly active life. He, after graduating from West Point, he served as an officer in the U.S. Army in Iraq and Afghanistan, then as a professor of history at his alma mater, West Point. By the time he left the military in 2019, Danny had become a strident peace activist and critic of U.S. interventionism. He's written 3 books and numerous articles challenging America's overseas policy. Danny has also assisted with Black Lives Matter and the Free Palestine movement. Finally, he's a fellow graduate of the University of Kansas History Department, so I had to include that last bit right there. You can learn more about Danny's activities at his website, skepticalvet.com, and his podcast, Fortress on a Hill. So the book that inspired me to ask Danny to do this program is, it's a short read, but a good one. It's called Patriotic Dissent, Patriotic Dissent, yes. And I was a little distracted there. My dog actually pulled this off the shelf, Danny, and chewed it up. So I'm sorry to say you have at least one biting critic. You know, it's
well done. Well done.
Yeah, it's at least this critic can't talk. You know, but it's an excellent book and a provocative book, as Danny always is. I want to mention that Danny's books can be purchased. I believe the first 2 books at least can be purchased through our friends at the Raven Bookstore here in Lawrence, who are also partners in tonight's event. Go to ravenbookstore.com and do a title or author search for just about any book you want. We encourage you, the audience members, to join us in this conversation by posting questions for our guest in the Q&A feature. Please use only the Q&A feature and not the chat feature. That'll make it a little bit easier on me to keep control of the questions. So with that, I'd just like to jump in. So hello, Danny, and thanks for joining us.
Will, it's always a pleasure. And I think last time we spoke, it was at LBC, just east of Mass Street. So it's a little more virtual, but it's always a pleasure. We have great talks.
Absolutely. We'll have to get back down there somewhere else and share a pint at some point. So Danny, I'm going to jump into the questions now about patriotic dissent and anti-war activism during this long era known as the Cold War. We see a lot in popular culture about anti-Russian feelings and anti-war movements during the Vietnam War, but really not much else when it comes to peace activism and domestic opposition to U.S. policy during this long period. In your book, Patriotic Dissent, you discuss a long tradition of American peace activism and say that it's, quote, as American as apple pie, unquote. So could you give us the backstory to peace movements up to 1945?
So I think that what's really important about this is timelines. Like, when do we start counting and when do we decide we're in a certain era? I mean, a lot of it is pretty arbitrary. So when we talk about the Cold War, right, 1945 is what you have listed there. So, and that makes sense, right? That's when people think the Cold War started, right? World War II is over. And we don't think it's strange at all that we're immediately in a new war. It's just a cold one, right? Of course, millions of people died in that Cold War because it was often very hot locally. But actually, there are 2 things that I would want to say about this. The first one is the Cold War is actually older than that. And meaning the Cold War with Russia, you know, historians, well, as you know, we'll talk about the long Cold War. This idea that really from the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, right, like Red October 1917, like, let's be clear, the United States is wildly anti Russia, right? Anti-communist. So much so that, you know, something that Americans have forgotten, but Russians have not, including our friend Vladimir Putin, right, is that American troops, as part of a multinational coalition, are actually in like Siberia and as well as like up in like the Caucasus, or at least the British troops were in an intervention backing the former czarist white Russians against the red Russians, meaning the communists. And of course, Russians have not forgotten this. When I was at West Point, there's a room in Cullum Hall, which is like one of our, you know, fancy buildings, where they have the list of every graduate that's died in a war. And there's a small little plaque with the person's name, the class that they graduated from, and where they died. There is one graduate on that wall, and it says, I don't even remember the exact terminology they use, but it's like something like Siberia intervention. Okay, because there was one West Point graduate who died because Americans died in that war. So in other words, the Cold War is long, and one could argue that the Cold War we're going to be talking about today is sort of like Cold War 2.0 or phase 2 of the main Cold War. And one of the things I'll mention later is, are we in a phase 3, right? Which maybe we are. But in terms of peace movements up to 1945, if anti-war activism is as American as apple pie, let me be clear, pro-war activism is more American than apple, like it's more American than apple pie. It's the more common one, right? So, but the thing about the United States is, you know, there's generally people rally around the flag for wars. So I don't want to overemphasize these peace movements. Very rarely have they ever ended a war, like in and of themselves. But I think the way to look at it is there's basically three phases of anti-war activism prior to 1945. The first major national anti-war movement that is like regionally varied is during the Mexican-American War. And so, you know, people have heard of civil disobedience by Thoreau, but people forget that someone like John Quincy Adams was wildly opposed to this Mexican-American War, which is a wildly aggressive war. Anyway, eventually, by the end of that war, there's massive anti-war sentiment, including this freshman congressman who just comes in and then loses his seat because he goes anti-war, because that very rarely plays politically. And some people might have heard of him. It's Abraham Lincoln, of course, right? And then the second big phase is when America stops being just a continental empire, right, against Native Americans and the Mexicans, and then goes overseas to fight the Spanish, takes over the Philippines. That phase of anti-war activism is really interesting. Now we're talking 1898 to about 1902. There's something called the Anti-Imperialist League, but it's business people like Andrew Carnegie, who you wouldn't expect there. It's political people like William Jennings Bryan, you know, Cross of Gold, right, all of this. But it's also, as always, you know, kind of cultural figures, Mark Twain. And there's a racial component because, you know, people in the civil rights movement, like W.E.B. Du Bois, like they're involved too. So there's that. And then that last phase before 1945 is World War I. You know, people forget that World War I was really contested. I mean, not everybody thought we should be in that war. We remember World War I collectively, I think, as Americans, as really phase 1 of World War II. You know, the Kaiser is basically Hitler light. But of course, that's not actually accurate. Germany was way more complicated than that, the causes of that war. But anyway, in that war, you have a lot of anti-war activism, anti-draft activism. Eugene Debs, of course, who runs for president 3 or 4 times, is jailed, right, in federal prison because of his opposition to the war. And you've got the Espionage Acquisition Act. So I guess the backstory of these peace movements is usually when there's a war, the majority support it, especially in the South and the West of America. There is a regional flavor to this. And then there is always a strong sort of anti-imperial entity that forms eventually, but it still maintains the minority. And I think what's important is that the language it uses is usually anti-imperial and builds on this idea that America was formed in opposition to a British Empire, so let us not become that again. And so I think that's the basic backstory.
Well, you did an excellent job summarizing anti-imperialism up to this era. So let's go forward, and it's, you know, the mid to late 1940s, after the Second World War. The line is being drawn between two superpowers, you know, the United States and the Soviet Union. So who were some of the prominent voices that raised concerns about the rising tensions between these two nuclear powers? And what were some of the early events that sparked concern?
I think that one of the things that's most interesting and not spoken about enough is that you mentioned that they're nuclear powers. The scientists involved in creating the nuclear bomb, right, the atomic bomb, are some of the most active, dissidents in some ways against this new Cold War. Folks like Einstein. I mean, these scientists who worked on the program. It's not all of them, but it's probably the majority. They're writing open letters to Harry Truman saying we need to internationalize the control of atomic weapons or just get rid of them. And they're basically saying we can't live on this like precipice of nuclear war. That should have been jarring. Like that should have been really striking. But in case it seems strange that it wasn't, remember that look at climate change today, right? Just because there's a scientific consensus does not mean that political leaders or common American citizens are going to really listen to it. So that was one element, but there were political figures, some of whom were fairly prominent, who were standing astride history like conservatives say they were and yelling stop, except they were generally on the progressive end. And so as early as 1945, 46, 47, you have a guy like Henry Wallace, right? Lost to history, or at least most lay people's history, but the former vice president under FDR. And in one of the great counterfactuals in history, Henry Wallace is replaced by Harry Truman for the 1944 election. The idea being that, Harry Truman, this kind of unknown like figure from the Prendergast machine in Kansas City, that might resonate with some of our listeners. He was seen as like a better balance to Henry Wallace, who was like considered fairly progressive. But in that last term or part term of FDR, he's, I believe, like the agriculture secretary or commerce. So he's still in the administration, but Henry Wallace is saying, no, we can't jump right into a new Cold War with Russia. In fact, what we need to do is live up to the Atlantic Charter. We need to live up to this. And he called it like the one world theory, like that we're going to have one world. We're not going to have a divided binary world. And his position was that, look, the United States is going to have to make some compromises, and it's on us. Like, do we want to be the country that's going to make this Cold War worse? It wasn't necessarily apologism for the Soviets, but that's how it was played. And Henry Wallace, who had been this really prominent and somewhat popular figure in the FDR years, is suddenly a pinko, a communist, un-American somehow. And so I think that's kind of at the start. And what the early events that spark concern, the formation of NATO. I mean, how many lay people, right, not geeky historians like us, know that NATO forms years before the Warsaw Pact? Like, we militarize first. None of this is to say that the Soviet position in Eastern Europe wasn't problematic. It's to say, what could we really do about it? And from a military standpoint, which the answer is nothing. And then the question is, how do you want to handle it from there? Well, isn't it strange that we would take the three zones of West Germany, right, the occupied zones, French, British, and American, unify them, create a country known as West Germany, and then put them in NATO, a military alliance which was formed in opposition to Russia, anti-Russian from the start. And then we're surprised when the Soviet Union is upset about that. They've been invaded by Germany twice and France once, right? 3 land invasions from the West. So, I think that was one of the key early events. And so when you hear about things like the Berlin blockade and therefore the Berlin airlift, the story is, wow, the American Air Force was so heroic. Isn't it incredible what we were able to do? And aren't those Russians so bad for blockading Berlin? And there's never any context or backstory. Like, why might they do that? And I would just say that the view from Moscow mattered then, and it matters now. And it doesn't mean that that's the correct view. It means we should know what they are thinking, and they're rational actors, and they might have a point.
Absolutely. You're thinking like a historian, like we all should when we're thinking about these great moments. So unfortunately, into tonight's event, we have to jump forward in time at a fairly rapid clip. And you've already given us a lot to think about. But for Americans, the Vietnam War hangs almost like an albatross on our nation in the 1960s and 70s, and it's colored our history ever since. So how did our involvement in that corner of the world fit into our larger Cold War engagement? And why do you think the war eventually sparked such intense opposition at home? At home being the United States.
A lot of younger people today and this isn't a negative or pejorative, even my war, the Iraq War, like the one that really changed my life, is ancient history. I mean, it may as well be the Battle of Thermopylae. Like I had a waitress in a local place, who's like 18, and she's a political science major, and she said, we're studying the Iraq War, and I still don't understand why we did it. And then I had to remember, wow, like she was a child when we invaded. But Vietnam really lingered much longer than that. I mean, people our age, right? Up until 9/11, Vietnam was the historical touchstone when it came to American war policy or foreign policy. It hovered, like you said, like over everything. And everything was a question of, is this going to be the new Vietnam? And so early in the war on terror, like, Afghanistan, Iraq, all the comparisons were Vietnam. Now, I do think that Vietnam is starting to fade a little. And now I think Iraq and Afghanistan are going to become the new touchstones. And I don't know whether that's positive or negative. I think it's interesting how we remember it. The thing about Vietnam is that the way it fit into our broader Cold War engagement is that it was a totally misunderstood abstraction that was very deductive. So we get involved in Vietnam based on a big lie and a long con. A big lie and a long con. And the big lie and the long con is that communism is a monolith. Communism is a monolith. So Chinese communism and Russian communism, maybe not Yugoslav, but pretty much any communism is one thing. And a plus, a check mark in the communist column, if they could turn a country communist, is a minus for us. So North Vietnam goes communist, right? After they kicked the French out in 1954. Of course, what's misunderstood about that is Ho Chi Minh and most of the communist movement in Vietnam, they're nationalist and anti-imperial as much as they're communist. And of course, by the way, we could apply a lot of this to Islamism today, which I'll get to at some point. So we get involved in Vietnam based on this big lie, long con, that if communism wins anywhere, then there's going to be a domino theory. I mean, I could argue, and I will, that from 1946 to 1991, almost every single American intervention, either active, overt troops or proxies, is based on that lie. And that every one of them should have and could have been avoided, but that this was the working formula. So historians like to be inductive, or at least we say we do, right? Inductive reasoning, bottom up, where at West Point, we would always make fun of the social sciences department. We'd say, oh, they're deductive, big model types. But the Cold War is a deductive entity. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that most Cold Wars are, because you create a model and you fit everything into it. The reason I think that war of all wars sparked such intense opposition is essentially twofold. One, media was different. Okay, technology was different. So even more so than Korea, which was only about 12 years before American Marines, really entered Vietnam in 1965, the amount of TV was different, right? The actual visuals of this war. And I don't want to overplay the tech side, but I do think it was important. But the main thing is there was still a draft. There was still a draft. So you've got this sort of like cultural movement that's going on around a million issues. I mean, Vietnam unfolds at the very moment that civil rights activism is like at its height in America. The gay and lesbian and like that movement is just coming together, right? So many things are changing culturally, and there's a draft that's taking these very college kids who are going through this like enlightening or awakening that's going on culturally, and telling them you might have to go fight for this country in the war that is televised, and you can see American bodies, but you can also see the indecency of like our bombing, right? Because we maybe kill 1 million Vietnamese civilians over the course of our, because we're carpet bombing a country. So I think that that's the key thing that sparks the intense opposition. And one thing we have to grapple with, and I'll kind of pause there and see if we end up there, is what happens when you get rid of that draft? And isn't it interesting that when Nixon goes to a lottery system and then eventually removes the draft completely, is it completely accidental that we start to see kind of a tamp down of that anti-war opposition? And frankly, while there are serious anti-war activists today, civilian and military, I think we have to be honest, we've never seen anything like it. We don't see that kind of activism against an American war. You can starve 100,000 Yemeni babies to death, right? You can do that. Like, you can support the Saudis doing that, and it's not going to raise a whole lot. How many people are in the streets? Like, I mean, I've been in the streets with some organizations, like 9 of us, and I know that it's more than that sometimes. But so, in other words, the indecency of the American behavior is not necessarily the driving factor. And I don't mean to be too cynical or say that people only care when their skin is in the game, but I think we have to grapple with this in a serious way.
Well, that's excellent. And Danny, I'd like to dig a little bit more into the makeup and what these anti-war groups were like during the Vietnam era. So, I know that you've spoken to some of these guys from this time, and some of these veterans who joined this growing movement during the war. So, who are some of the major players or in the growing peace movement? And in the end, how much do you think? I have several questions here, but in the end, how much do you think this peace activism actually affected the war effort?
So I'm going to start with that last part. Vietnam historians, they're as contested as the Vietnam War. I mean, man, you're like talking historiography, meaning historians arguing about history. Vietnam historians probably argue as much or more than anybody. I mean, it is very intense. And there's one of the big arguments revolves around whether or not the peace movement in the United States had any real effect on the war ending. I don't think a consensus has formed on that. And my old boss at West Point, Greg Daddis, is like one of the main voices in this, right? And so, like, I almost wish I could like phone a friend, you know what I mean? Like, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire style, But we've talked about this a million times. And, I think that if there's anything remotely approaching a consensus, it's that the anti-war movement at home was important in terms of a catalyst, keeping the war on people's minds, ending the war like as a major issue, but it wasn't decisive necessarily, right? I mean, Richard Nixon is not a guy who's particularly responsive to grassroots movements, right? I mean, let's be clear. I mean, it may have affected his calculus. He understood he couldn't like surge a major, influx of soldiers, but it didn't stop him from, illegally bombing Cambodia and Laos and invading both. It didn't stop him from doing the Christmas bombings, around 1973, like right at the end of the war. But I do think that it was different from some previous American wars, specifically World War II and Korea, in that this kept it on the public agenda. And it influenced the Democratic Party. I mean, it is no small thing, and I think we have to take this seriously, that you go from LBJ, right, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, he's a liberal hawk. He's a Truman liberal hawk. He would prefer to pay attention to domestic stuff, but he fits in the Cold War model. He's not dissimilar to John Kennedy, or at least in that general mold. And then you get Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president, to run. He's probably a little more progressive on some issues than LBJ, but he's still within the Cold War model. But by 1972, 4 years after LBJ leaves, you've got George McGovern. Right. So, the Democratic Party has moved to a peace position. I mean, I own George McGovern T-shirts and buttons that say "For Peace, McGovern." There are campaign buttons from the time that say "Stop killing babies, vote George McGovern." I mean, can you imagine a major Democratic Party candidate taking on the mantle of that? Now, it was a fleeting moment, because what the Democrats learned from this is that anti-war activism doesn't work politically. It doesn't sell because McGovern gets trounced by Nixon. So I guess the point there is that it was important, but I don't think that we can draw a direct link to say it ended the war. That being said, who was in the movement, right? Who comprised it? The common view to a certain extent is that it was all like privileged college kids, like the pejorative from the right, especially even today. This is how it's remembered. My father thinks this, right? It was like privileged college kids who didn't want to fight for their country, and they had that privilege to protest. But actually, it was more complicated than that. There was an intersection of movements. It was like a movement of movements, right? So you've got the people who were involved in civil rights activism, who were saying, Muhammad Ali or Martin Luther King eventually. All the folks in SNCC, they're saying, why am I going to go over to Vietnam, We're sending the poorest kids, because of the way the draft is made up, to go kill other people of color overseas in the interest of this indecency, when we can't even vote in America, right? So there's like this civil rights element to it. There is an anti-draft activism. Some folks just don't want to, give up their lives and go die in Vietnam. And it's complicated, just like the Mexican War and just like the Philippine War. So what you've got is you've got civil rights people, you've got cultural icons, right? Jane Fonda, right? Hanoi Jane, nothing worse, right? Of course, she's vindicated in every way. I mean, everything she believed was right. We could argue about her tactics, but it's interesting that, so you have these cultural figures, these political figures, these civil rights figures, and they all kind of coalesce into this like vague anti-war movement, which was never as organized as they thought. And oh, by the way, the last important thing about this is, how does the government respond? It responds as it always does in Cold Wars. And by Cold War, I mean having an enemy, an other. You have to have an other, right? You want to control the population. You want to consolidate power in the executive branch. You need another. You need an enemy. Well, the way they respond is by saying that everyone who's against the war in Vietnam, just like they said about people who wanted drinking fountains to not be based on race, okay? And I'm not minimizing that, I'm showing how ridiculous it is, right, through my hyperbole. What they're saying is, you're a communist. You're not against the war in Vietnam because it's wrong to bomb babies. You're not against the war in Vietnam because it doesn't make sense intellectually to fight this war based on the lie and the con that it's a monolith and that you could even win. The reason you're against the war in Vietnam is because you're actually a communist. You actually secretly support them. And I think that's an important point, because dissidents and dissenters, it rarely ends well for them. We may remember them later as very positive in retrospect, but most of them die very alone and isolated and sort of ostracized.
Well, so moving on from the Vietnam War, if we ever can. So the late 70s and 80s, I remember a little bit of the tail end of this, and you do as well. They have a reputation for being sort of a vapid time when Americans show less concern for world affairs. Maybe we turn inward a bit. But American interventionism, of course, continued apace all around the world during the Carter and Reagan years. So were there any groups and individuals that pushed back against this continued foreign engagement? And was there any continuity with Vietnam era groups?
I think that the late 70s and early 80s is totally misremembered, which I could probably say that about every decade, right? Every historian says that, because it's often true. So the mythology around the late 70s and 80s is that we're in the 70s now, it's the me decade. And oh, by the way, all the hippies, it's like The Big Chill or something, like that old movie, like all the hippies from Vietnam, now they're going to all become like Wall Street, greed is good. And they all become Reagan Democrats because they never really believed in any of that in the first place. They were just stupid kids, and the world's going to get you, right? I mean, that's a concept that I think is out there, and there's some limited truth in it. I mean, obviously there are elements of that we have to explain, like how these people who were once Democrats end up being like neoconservatives or Reagan people. But the idea that there weren't active folks in the late 70s and early 80s is a total misunderstanding, because I wish sometimes today that we had the level of activism we did in the early 80s on the streets. So what kind of forces were at work here? Well, here's a few. Folks forget the nuclear freeze movement, which was international. This will like get rid of nuclear weapons, tamp down the Cold War. 1 million people in Central Park, 1 million, right? Simon and Garfunkel playing a concert, like getting back together for it, like, which by the way is like always a good thing, right? But I mean, so this was an important movement. And actually there's a lot of historians who are writing about this now, that it had a bigger effect internationally than we maybe think, or people remember. Reagan in the early 80s and really throughout his tenure is decimating Central America, overtly backing the worst actors, right-wing death squads, either state-sponsored ones in El Salvador, the types that like murder and rape American nuns and shoot the Archbishop Oscar Romero on his altar. These are not good people. Many of them, by the way, trained by American military folks. Keep an eye on that in Africa today. And then, of course, in Nicaragua, going the opposite way, right? So we're still backing right-wing militant death squads, but this time they're the insurgents. They're freedom fighters, right? And hundreds of thousands of dead based on America's backing of these anti-communist, but the only thing that was going for them was that they were anti-communist. Mm-hmm. These were monsters. I mean, these are monstrous groups. People forget that there were serious activists who were opposed to this. And who were they? Well, they were, as ever, they're a very complex group, but a lot of them were former anti-Vietnam War activists. Veterans for Peace, I'm a member, and I've been pretty active in that. They actually form in the early 80s. They're kind of an outgrowth of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, but that kind of like peters out and then they reform. A lot of Veterans for Peace's early activism is against these wars in Central America. And there's a lot of people involved. The church is involved, certain like more progressive elements in the church, including the Catholic Church, right? This like liberation theology, which never totally took hold in the American church, but it was big. And the Democratic Party was fairly responsive to it. The Democratic Party in the early 80s was more anti-war than the Democratic Party today. It wasn't as anti-war as George McGovern in 1972, but they took seriously their liberal elements like grassroots activism against Reagan's proxy wars in Central America. And I will tell you this is where it gets interesting, is my last point on this. I was watching a documentary recently, and one of my areas, if you look behind me, I've got a lot of like Spanish Civil War, anti-fascist propaganda. That's one of my just interests, right? Like my idea of a good time is like just not sleep and, watch documentaries and read about the Spanish Civil War. The Lincoln Brigade, the American volunteers, thousands of them who go to Spain and then get slaughtered, like in the Jarama Valley, right? Like higher casualty rate than like any American unit that was officially in the American Army. They would have these reunions, the survivors of the Lincoln Brigade, the anti-fascist volunteers who went over there. And I was watching a documentary about them, and it was like the end of it, and they were kind of doing the credits, and they're showing today. And by the way, the documentary is made in the mid 80s. So you've got these anti-Contra, anti-Reagan supporting El Salvador protests that are happening. And you've got like Veterans for Peace folks there. Okay, many of them Vietnam veterans who are now anti-war. You've got just other civilian activists for just against indecency. You've got the nuclear freeze people, and then coming marching down the rally are these, at this point, probably in their 60s or 70s, veterans of the Lincoln Brigade, right? And so what I'm saying is, in the early 80s, there was a vibrant anti-war community. It may not have won out. It didn't change Reagan's policy, but it was there, and it was multifaceted, as it often is. And I think we misremember the 80s as a just Wall Street, greed is good era. It was more than that. And actually, I would like to have that level of activism today.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, so to jump forward again to the fall of the Soviet Union, late 80s, 1990 or so, President George Bush Sr., he promoted this so-called New World Order that was supposedly based on international cooperation. And how did this gel, do you think, with the reality of American foreign policy at the time? And well, maybe I'll ask that first, and then I'll ask what, in some ways, I think is the $10,000 question here.
The idea that the New World Order was about international cooperation it's not only a sort of a myth, it's almost farcical. I mean, the reality of the post-Cold War era can be summed up in the phrases that serious Americans used. Serious figures that we take seriously use the following terms: unipolar moment. Unipolar moment. Think about what that says. It's saying the United States is like the single hegemon, and this is our moment. It's almost like all that city on a hill stuff from 1630 is like finally coming to fruition, right? There's no more enemies. Like we can do whatever we want with the world. It's like this fresh piece of clay, and we can just mold it. Indispensable nation, right? If not us, who? We're the ones who have to solve all the problems. I think the reality is that, when the Soviet Union, quote unquote, falls, the United States dances on its grave. and is really, really excited. And oh, by the way, the other thing that happened right at that moment. So when we say the fall of the Soviet Union, we're talking December 1991. Like when the Soviet Union breaks up, all those republics become independent. We have a circumscribed Russian Federation. Gorbachev goes home and Boris Yeltsin comes in. And I think what had happened right before that, if folks remember, is January and February 1991, we win the first Persian Gulf War. And sometimes I think that's like almost the worst thing that ever happened to us. I mean, as like a modern American state, a modern American military, because, okay, so Russia's already on their way out. Berlin Wall's down in 89. It's very clear that the Russians are like on the downslide. It's a question of when they're going to fall. They're definitely not the threat they used to be. They didn't veto our stuff to invade or, to push Iraq out of Kuwait like they would have maybe in the past when the Cold War was heightened. And then we win this amazing victory, a TV victory, 100-hour war, 148 Americans killed total, many of those from friendly fire, somewhere near 50%, a bloodless war on television that's so tech savvy and so seemingly completely clean, completely one-sided against Iraq in the desert. And we learned a lot of lessons from this. And I think the timing matters because the Soviets are on their way out and our military is vindicated on a level we can't even imagine. We are unbeatable. That was the view. I remember it. There were trading cards put out by the Topps company. Like, I believe the first series was called like Coalition for Peace or something, which, like, talk about a euphemism, right? I mean, imagine a time when the military is so adulated that the Topps company creates trading cards with like generals and all the equipment, and then you can like flip it over and read like, oh, made by Raytheon, like, and then the victory parade that happens right afterwards is literally sponsored and like partly funded by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. And it's this pageantry and the yellow ribbons come back. It's like literally yellow, like the whole yellow ribbon thing that we think of today had been kind of dormant for a while and then came back with the Gulf War. So I think that how it gelled with the reality of foreign policy is that America got really good at believing its own rhetoric, or American public figures did, and then the people to some extent acquiesced. So we're talking about how, look, this isn't our victory. This is a global victory. Now democracy is going to break out everywhere. But if you look at actual American behavior, right, largely, it's hegemonic. It's celebratory. And one of the ways, speaking of the Cold War, that you know that is true is that the Russians had said, hey, we'll let you not only reunify Germany, we'll let you put them in NATO, which is a big deal, right? Germany's a big population, big economy. I don't know. I mean, they've been known to invade places, right? It's a thing. But they agreed to this. And essentially what had been said, based on the reporting of, the inside conversations is like, don't expand NATO East, don't dance on our grave, that kind of thing. And that's exactly what happens. That's the behavior of a country that misunderstands how fleeting the moment was, overestimates its power, and is in a sort of triumphalist format. And I think that was the reality. So the reality is that the end of the Cold War is America like going to the debutante ball of hegemony, right? Excited, like coming out on the world scene, but masking it in this behavior or this rhetoric that says, oh, it's global internationalist, but it never was. Not really.
Yeah. Well, can we draw any lines from this period right after the end of the Cold War and Desert Storm directly to the war on terror that we're still engaged in today, and that you, and to a lesser extent I, were intimately connected with?
I think we can. I mean, one of the ways we can is that the war on terror doesn't happen the way it does if the Cold War was still going on. Meaning that, look, the Russians were never, the Soviets were never as powerful as the United States. It was always very lopsided. I mean, the truth is, like, when we talk economics, we were always the stronger of the two. And in some ways we built like a 10-foot tall enemy. But the Russians did have the ability to check American behavior to a certain extent. They could back proxies. They had their votes at the UN, and they had the nuclear threat, just like we did, right? You could raise the ante, like, oh, you're going to do that? Well, maybe there'll be a nuclear war over it. So there was a degree of checking behavior. That's gone in 1991. It's just gone. And it's dormant for a while. You know what I mean? Yeltsin is just like drinking in the Kremlin, and like, I'm exaggerating a little, but I mean, there's a dormancy there until Putin comes back in. I do not think that America would have been capable or even considered responding to the attacks of 9/11 as hegemonically and absurdly adventurous as they did if the Cold War had not just ended. You know, so September 11th, 2001 is just under 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And I do not think we can understand the way America responded without framing it in this unipolar moment, indispensable nation talk. It seemed that the United States could do anything. And so when the neoconservatives in the Bush administration, aided and abetted by the liberal internationalists in the Democratic Party, including the top cheerleader for the thing, current President Joe Biden, let's be clear, that's the record, right? That's the historical record. They believed America could do anything. Only a country that believes it is indispensable, that believes it won the Cold War, whatever that means, would, I think, dare to think you could invade Iraq under any pretense, and doesn't even matter, and then remake the society. I mean, if you look at the language of the Bush administration, 2003, 2004, 2005 about Iraq, the grandiosity of it is the story to me. That's what I think 50 years from now, what stories we're going to talk about. I think what the question they'll be trying to answer, if I had a guess, is how in the world did this happen? Right? Like, I don't think that we've even grappled with how absurd America's response to 9/11 was, especially in Iraq. But I think the reason you can draw lines is because it's a direct reflection of the psychosis of victory. A.J. Muste, who was, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, he was a peace activist, pacifist around the time of World War II. He used to show this slide when I was teaching World War II to the cadets at West Point. And what he said, essentially, his quote was, the problem with victory, winning a war. He said this after World War II when everyone was excited about winning. That was our other triumphalist moment. He said, the problem with victory is you start to think that force works. You start to think that war pays. And that the problem is with the victor, not with the loser, because then you draw all these conclusions about what is then permissible and what war can achieve. And I really, really believe, and Andrew Basovich, who's a very prominent anti-war veteran type who I work with, West Point graduate in 1969, he just wrote a book about, I think it's called The Age of Illusions, about this post-Cold War moment. And he's really made this argument that I'm making now and really fleshed it out, that you cannot understand the absurdity, indecency, and hopelessness of America's response to the war on terror, to the 9/11 attacks, without understanding the fall of the Soviet Union 10 years before. And in a way, it's really a tragedy. I mean, not to say that the Soviet Union is something we always wanted around, but sometimes the second and third order effects are really messy.
Here's a pretty much direct quote from you. Know what the hell we're doing, because the thing is, it's all being done in your name. And it was being done in our name in 1919 and 1945 on down to the present. So, whether you agree with what Danny said tonight or not, that's educate yourselves about history and about current events. So you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us tonight.
Oh, thanks, Will. It's always a pleasure, and I hope we'll get to do more of that talking. And just on the last point about what's done in our name,
yeah.
I really don't necessarily care that everyone always agree with me, but it bothers me immensely when there's an apathy about this, so life is hard, and we're all just trying to get by in terms of economic issues and all that. But the truth is, whether you agree with what America does in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen, take a position, because it is in fact done in our name, and I think that that's an important point. So thanks for having me for this. Always a pleasure. I'll geek out with you anytime.
Absolutely. Oh, we'll definitely geek out again soon, hopefully face to face again. And thanks to all of you who joined us tonight for this discussion. Yeah, goodbye everybody, and thanks for joining us tonight.